The gunshot echoed through the tall pines as Katherine Campbell steadied her trembling hand, blood seeping through her tattered dress. The bullet had only grazed her shoulder, but she was already weak from days of running, hunger gnawing at her empty stomach. Behind her, the shouts of men who had taken everything from her grew closer. She stumbled forward, her vision blurring as the vast Colorado wilderness swallowed her whole. Grant Anderson spotted the trail of blood near the creek where he'd been fishing for his evening meal. The year was 1878, and this stretch of Colorado territory was still wild enough that a man needed to keep his wits about him. He set his fishing rod aside and drew his Colt revolver, following the crimson droplets with cautious steps. The woman lay crumpled beneath an ancient pine, her chestnut hair matted with dirt and blood, skin pale as the moon. For a moment, Grant thought he was too late. Then he saw the slight rise and fall of her chest. "Madam," he called softly, holstering his weapon and approaching slowly. "Madam, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open green as spring grass, but unfocused. She tried to scramble backward, pure terror in her gaze. "Please," she whispered, "don't take me back to him." Grant knelt beside her, keeping a respectful distance. "I ain't taking you anywhere except to safety, madam. You're hurt bad." She swayed, consciousness slipping. Grant assessed her quickly gunshot wound to the shoulder, exhaustion, probable hunger and thirst. He'd seen men die from less in the war. "You'll make it, I promise," he said firmly as her eyes rolled back. "I give you my word." He gathered her into his arms, surprised at how little she weighed, and whistled for his horse. Thunder approached with a soft nicker, and Grant carefully mounted with the unconscious woman cradled against his chest. His cabin was a good hour's ride away, and darkness was falling. Whatever trouble this woman was in had followed her here, and Grant knew enough about trouble to recognize it wouldn't be far behind. The ride back was tense, Grant constantly scanning the tree line for any sign of pursuit. The woman stirred occasionally, mumbling incoherent words, her body burning with fever. When his cabin finally came into view, a sturdy structure he'd built with his own hands 3 years ago, relief washed through him. Inside, he gently laid her on his bed, lighting lamps and stoking the fire to ward off the mountain chill. The woman's dress was torn and filthy, the shoulder soaked with blood. Grant gathered clean linens, water, and the medical supplies he kept on hand. Living alone in these mountains made a man his own doctor. "Madam," he said gently, "I need to tend that wound. I promise I'll be proper, but that bullet needs cleaning." She didn't respond, lost in fever dreams. Grant worked efficiently, cutting away the fabric around the wound with his hunting knife. It was a clean furrow across the top of her shoulder. The bullet had grazed rather than penetrated, which was a blessing. He cleaned the wound with whiskey, wincing when she cried out, then stitched it closed with steady hands that had mended too many wounds during the war. When he finished, he covered her with a blanket, placed a cool cloth on her forehead, and settled into his chair by the fire. Whoever she was running from might still be tracking her. Grant checked his rifle and pistol, then poured himself a small measure of whiskey. "What kind of trouble are you in, lady?" he murmured, watching the rise and fall of her chest. "And what kind of man shoots a woman in the back?" Dawn broke with golden fingers stretching across the cabin floor. Grant had dozed intermittently, always with one eye open. The woman's fever had spiked during the night, and he'd spent hours bathing her face and neck with cool water, spooning broth between her cracked lips whenever she was lucid enough to swallow. "Water," she rasped suddenly, startling him from his half-sleep. Grant moved quickly to her side, helping her sip from a tin cup. "Easy now, not too fast." Her eyes were clearer today, taking in the cabin, then settling on him with wariness. "Who are you?" she asked, voice rough from disuse. "Grant Anderson. Found you half dead in the woods yesterday." "You've been shot," she nodded weakly. "I remember the shot." She tried to sit up but fell back with a gasp of pain. "Best stay still, madam. You lost a fair amount of blood." She studied him, caution in every line of her body. "Why are you helping me?" Grant shrugged. "Would you rather I'd left you for the wolves?" A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "No, thank you, Mr. Anderson. Grant is fine, and you might be." She hesitated, and he saw calculation in her eyes. Katherine, she finally said. Katherine Campbell. Well, Miss Campbell, you're safe here for now, but I reckon whoever put that bullet in you isn't far behind. Fear flashed across her face. I need to leave today, Grant shook his head. You can barely lift your head, let alone ride. Besides, there's a storm coming in, I can smell it. As if confirming his words, distant thunder rumbled. Katherine closed her eyes, exhaustion evident in every line of her face. They'll kill you too, she whispered. If they find me here, wouldn't be the first time someone's tried, Grant replied evenly. Rest now. We'll figure things out when you're stronger. She drifted back to sleep, and Grant moved to the window, scanning the woods around his cabin. The coming storm would cover their tracks, buy them time. But he'd lived long enough to know that some men were like bloodhounds once they got the scent of their prey. Grant spent the morning reinforcing the cabin's defenses, checking ammunition, and preparing for potential visitors. The storm rolled in by midday, sheets of rain lashing against the windows. Katherine's fever broke around the same time, and she woke more lucid. Hungry? Grant asked, offering a bowl of venison stew. She nodded, struggling to sit up. Grant helped her, propping pillows behind her back. Thank you, she said, accepting the bowl. Her hands trembled slightly as she brought the spoon to her lips. Been a while since you ate proper, I'm guessing, Grant observed. Katherine nodded. 3 days, maybe 4. It all blurs together when you're running. Mind telling me who you're running from? She paused, spoon halfway to her mouth. A man named Victor Blackwell. He owns half the mining operations near Silver Creek. Grant frowned. Heard of him, didn't hear good things. The stories don't capture half of what he's capable of, Katherine said bitterly. I was his wife's companion. After she died last winter, she shuddered. He decided I should take her place. When I refused, he locked me in a room for weeks, said I'd change my mind eventually. But you escaped. During a dinner party, I took a horse and rode until it couldn't go any further, then I walked. She met his eyes. I'll understand if you want me gone once this storm passes. I've brought nothing but trouble. Grant studied her for a long moment. At 28, he'd spent the last decade trying to outrun his own ghosts from the war. He recognized the hunted look in her eyes. Trouble finds folks whether they invite it or not, he said finally. I'm not in the habit of turning away those who need help. He rose from his chair. Finish that stew. You need your strength. Katherine watched him move around the cabin, this stranger who had saved her life. He moved with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin, broad-shouldered and tall, with a sandy beard that couldn't hide the scar running along his jawline. His eyes were the clear blue of a mountain lake, revealing little of his thoughts. Were you a soldier? She asked suddenly. Grant paused in checking his rifle. Was Confederate cavalry not something I'm proud of these days? The war's been over for 13 years. Some wars never really end, Miss Campbell, not in here. He tapped his temple. Now try to get some more rest. Storm's likely to last through tomorrow. The rain continued through the night and into the next day. Katherine's strength returned slowly, and by the second morning she could sit at the rough-hewn table for meals. Grant was a surprisingly good cook, having learned to fend for himself after the war. Why do you live all the way out here alone? Katherine asked as they shared a breakfast of johnnycakes and coffee. Grant considered her question. After the war, couldn't stand being around too many people, too much noise, too many memories. He sipped his coffee. Out here, a man can hear himself think. Don't you get lonely? A smile touched the corner of his mouth. Got my horse. Few friends in town I see when I need supplies. Books. He gestured to a small shelf stacked with well-worn volumes. Company enough most days. Katherine nodded, understanding the appeal of solitude after her months of captivity in Blackwell's mansion. What will you do? Grant asked. Once you're well enough to travel, Katherine stared into her coffee cup. I have a sister in California if I can reach her. She trailed off. The prospect of traveling hundreds of miles alone with Blackwell's men hunting her seemed impossible. San Francisco's a long way, Grant observed. And Blackwell strikes me as a man who doesn't give up what he thinks is his. I'm not his, Katherine said fiercely. I never was and never will be, Grant nodded approvingly. No, you're not, but men like that don't see reason easily, He hesitated. "I could get you to the train in Silverton. From there, you could reach California in a week or so." Hope flickered in Catherine's eyes. "You do that." "Said I'd help, didn't I? But your home, you'd be leaving it unprotected." Grant shrugged. "Cabins stood through worse than a few angry men. Besides, I doubt they'd find it unless they got lucky. I built it to be hidden." Catherine studied him, wondering at this quiet, capable man who risked himself for a stranger. In her 24 years, she'd known few men of genuine kindness. Her father had been one, but he died when she was 16, leaving her and her sister to make their way in a world that offered limited options for women without means. "Why are you really helping me, Mr. Anderson?" she asked softly. Grant looked at her for a long moment. "During the war, I saw too many people look away when they could have helped. Told myself if I survived, I'd never be that man." He rose from the table. "Storm's lifting. I need to check the perimeter, make sure no one's been sniffing around." He donned his coat and hat, strapping on his gunbelt with practiced ease. At the door, he paused. "There's a shotgun under the bed if you need it. Don't hesitate to use it." After he left, Catherine moved carefully around the cabin, shoulder still tender but healing well. Grant's home was simple but well-crafted, with furniture he'd clearly made himself. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a daguerreotype of a young woman with a gentle smile, and beside it, a tarnished Confederate cavalry insignia. She picked up the photograph, wondering who this woman had been to him. Wife, sweetheart. The intimacy of handling his personal possessions suddenly struck her, and she carefully replaced the frame. Moving to the window, Catherine watched as Grant checked the surroundings, rifle ready. He moved with the alert grace of a mountain lion, eyes constantly scanning. Even from this distance, she could sense his tension. When he returned, he was carrying fresh rabbits for their dinner. "No sign of anyone," he reported, "but we should move soon, day after tomorrow if you're strong enough." That evening, as they sat before the fire, Grant taught Catherine how to clean and load his spare revolver. "A woman on her own needs to protect herself," he said, watching as her slender fingers worked the mechanism. "You're a natural." "My father taught me to shoot a rifle when I was young," she admitted. "We lived on a small farm in Missouri before the war. He said a girl should know how to defend the homestead." "Wise man. He died at Antietam," she said quietly, "fighting for the Union." Grant stilled, understanding the weight of her words. They had been enemies once, technically. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "War made fools of all of us." "Not you," Catherine said. "You're a good man, Grant Anderson." Their eyes met across the firelit space, and something shifted between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits despite their different paths. The next day, they prepared for the journey. Grant packed provisions, ammunition, and medical supplies. Catherine mended her dress as best she could with Grant's limited sewing supplies. Her shoulder had healed enough that she could move without sharp pain, though it remained stiff. 2 days' ride to Silverton, Grant explained as they studied a rough map he'd drawn. "We'll avoid the main trails, stick to the high country where it's harder to track. Once we reach town, we'll need to move fast, get you on the first train out." "And you?" Catherine asked. "What will you do after?" Grant folded the map. "Come back here, continue living." But his voice held a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. That night, as Catherine lay in Grant's bed, he had insisted on sleeping on a bedroll near the fire since she'd arrived. She found herself wondering what life would be like after she reached California. The sister she hadn't seen in 3 years. The unfamiliar city. The constant looking over her shoulder, wondering if Blackwell's reach extended even there. Sleep eluded her, and she was still awake when Grant stirred restlessly, muttering in his sleep. A nightmare, she realized as his movements became more agitated. Without thinking, she slipped from the bed and knelt beside him. "Grant," she whispered, touching his shoulder, "wake up, you're dreaming." He came awake suddenly, grabbing her wrist with reflexive speed. For a moment his eyes were wild, unseeing, then recognition dawned. "Catherine?" His voice was rough with sleep and remembered fear. "You were having a nightmare," she said gently. Grant released her wrist, passing a hand over his face. "Sorry, happens sometimes. The war," he nodded. "Always the same, Battle of Stones River. We charged a Union position. Artillery tore us apart." He swallowed hard. I was the only one from my unit who survived. Catherine's heart ached for the young man he must have been, barely more than a boy, witnessing such horror. I have nightmares too, she admitted. About being locked in that room, about running through the woods with men hunting me. Grant sat up, his face half in shadow. Reckon we're both a bit broken in our own ways. Maybe, Katherine said softly, or maybe just changed by what we've survived. In the dim light, their gazes held. Grant's hand moved almost of its own accord to brush a strand of hair from her face. The touch was feather light, but Katherine felt it like a current through her body. We should try to sleep, Grant said, his voice low. Long ride tomorrow. Katherine nodded and returned to the bed, but sleep remained elusive. In the darkness, she was acutely aware of Grant's presence across the room, his breathing eventually deepening as he drifted back to sleep. Dawn broke clear and cold. They ate a quick breakfast, then Grant saddled Thunder and a smaller mare he kept for pack trips. Hope you can ride, he said, helping Katherine mount the mare. Since I was a girl, she assured him, adjusting her position to accommodate her healing shoulder. Grant had given her one of his shirts and a spare coat, both too large but warmer than her tattered dress. They set out as the sun crested the eastern mountains, following a narrow game trail that wound upward through dense forest. Grant led, constantly alert, occasionally stopping to listen or check their back trail. By midday, they had climbed high enough to see the valley spreading below them, a patchwork of forests and meadows. They stopped in a sheltered clearing to rest the horses and eat a cold lunch of jerky and hardtack. There's a line shack about 4 hours ahead, Grant said, studying the terrain. Trapper I know uses it in winter. We can spend the night there, then make Silverton by tomorrow evening. Katherine nodded, trying to ignore the growing ache in her shoulder and the strange reluctance she felt about reaching Silverton. Each mile closer meant 1 mile closer to saying goodbye to Grant. They continued through the afternoon, the trail growing steeper and more challenging. Thunder picked his way confidently, but Katherine's mare sometimes hesitated at difficult passages. You're doing fine, Grant encouraged when he noticed Katherine's discomfort. Not much farther now. Just as the sun began its descent behind the western peaks, they reached the line shack, a crude but sturdy structure built against a cliff face for protection from the elements. Grant dismounted and checked the interior before helping Katherine down. No visitors, he reported. We'll be safe enough here. Inside, the shack was dusty but dry, with a small stone fireplace, a narrow cot, and basic supplies left by the trapper. Grant built a fire while Katherine tended to the horses, brushing them down and ensuring they had water from a nearby spring. As darkness fell, they shared a simple meal of beans and salt pork heated over the fire. The day's ride had exhausted Katherine more than she wanted to admit, and she found herself struggling to keep her eyes open. Take the cot, Grant said. I'll keep watch for a while. You need rest too, she protested. I'll wake you in a few hours. We'll take turns. Katherine was too tired to argue. She settled onto the cot, pulling the rough blanket around her shoulders, and was asleep almost instantly. She woke to Grant gently shaking her shoulder. Outside, the night was pitch black, the fire burned down to embers. Your watch, he said softly. Anything seems off, wake me immediately. Katherine nodded, taking the revolver he offered. Grant stretched out on the floor near the fire, using his saddle as a pillow. Within minutes, his breathing deepened in sleep. The night was eerily quiet, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or rustle of leaves in the light breeze. Katherine added wood to the fire, then sat near the door, revolver ready. The responsibility of keeping watch made her intensely aware of every sound, every shadow. She found herself studying Grant as he slept, the firelight casting his face in warm gold. The hard lines of his jaw and cheek softened in repose, making him look younger. She wondered about the woman in the daguerreotype, about the life Grant had lived before the war changed everything. Sometime past midnight, a noise outside snapped Katherine to full alertness. Footsteps, or just an animal? She rose silently, moving to the window. In the faint moonlight, she could make out shadowy figures approaching the cabin, 3 men leading horses, moving with the careful stealth of hunters. Her heart pounding, she crossed to Grant, placing her hand over his mouth as she woke him. His eyes opened instantly, alert. "3 men," she whispered, "coming this way." Grant was on his feet in seconds, checking his rifle. "Back door?" he asked in a barely audible voice. "There isn't one," Grant cursed under his breath. "Get behind the cot. If shooting starts, stay low." Katherine positioned herself as directed, her own revolver ready. Grant doused the fire with a cupful of water, plunging the cabin into darkness, then took up position beside the window. The footsteps drew closer. A voice whispered, "Light was coming from in there. Someone's inside." Another voice responded, "Check it. Could be her or someone who's seen her." Katherine's blood ran cold at the familiar voice. Jacob, Blackwell's foreman and most trusted enforcer. A heavy knock rattled the door. "Hello, the cabin. Anyone home?" Grant remained silent, rifle aimed at the door. "We're looking for a woman," the voice continued. "Young, brown hair. She's wanted for theft, reward for information." Still, Grant didn't respond. Katherine could hear the men conferring in low voices. "Door's not locked," one said. "Let's check inside." As the latch lifted, Grant's voice rang out, deadly calm. "I've got a rifle aimed at the door. Take 1 step inside, you're a dead man." The door froze, half open. "Easy, friend, we're just looking for a fugitive." "No fugitives here," Grant replied. "Just a tired man who doesn't take kindly to visitors in the middle of the night. Mind if we have a look around?" "I mind considerably. Now back away from my door before I put a hole in you." There was a tense silence, then the sound of a rifle being cocked. "You're outnumbered, friend," Jacob's voice called. "And if you're harboring that thieving witch, you're in a world of trouble." Grant's reply was to fire a shot through the partially open door. A cry of pain followed, along with a flurry of movement. "Next one goes between your eyes," Grant warned. "Now back off." Gunfire erupted, bullets splintering the wooden walls of the cabin. Katherine ducked lower as Grant returned fire methodically, his movements precise despite the chaos. A scream outside told her at least one of his shots had found its mark. The gunfire paused. "You've killed Tom," Jacob shouted, fury in his voice. "We're gonna burn you out." "Try it," Grant replied coldly. "Man with a torch makes an easy target." More gunfire, more deliberate shots from Grant. Then silence, broken only by groans from outside. "Think I got another one," Grant murmured. "Stay down." Minutes stretched like hours as they waited, listening. Finally, they heard the sound of horses galloping away. "They're retreating," Grant said, not lowering his rifle. "But they'll be back with more men." He moved to Katherine, helping her up. "We need to move now." "Where?" "They'll be watching the trail." "Not all the trails. There's a route through the high passes few know about. It's dangerous, but it'll get us to Silverton by a different approach." They gathered their essentials quickly: weapons, ammunition, food, and water. Outside, the body of one of Blackwell's men lay sprawled near the doorway. "Jacob and one other escaped," Grant said grimly. "Wounded by the blood trail, but alive." They mounted quickly, Grant leading them away from the shack at a gallop despite the darkness. Only when they'd put several miles between themselves and the lined shack did he slow to a more sustainable pace. "That trail they followed, it was my fault," Katherine said, guilt weighing on her. "I must have left tracks yesterday." "Not your fault," Grant replied. "These mountains are my home. I should have been more careful." He pointed ahead to where the terrain grew steeper. "The path ahead is treacherous. Stay close. Do exactly as I do." As dawn broke, they found themselves climbing a narrow trail that clung to the mountainside, a sheer drop of hundreds of feet to one side. Katherine focused on following Grant, trying not to look at the abyss beside them. "We'll rest the horses at the summit," Grant called back. "Then it's all downhill to Silverton." The path grew narrower still, forcing them to dismount and lead the horses single file. Katherine's shoulder throbbed with each step, and exhaustion made her movements clumsy. "Almost there," Grant encouraged, reaching back to steady her as she stumbled. His hand was warm and strong around hers. "You're doing great, Katherine." The summit revealed a breathtaking vista of mountains stretching to the horizon, peaks still capped with snow despite the summer season. They paused there, allowing the horses to rest while they ate a small portion of their provisions. "How far to Silverton?" Katherine asked, fighting to keep her eyes open. We'll reach it by nightfall if we push hard, Grant replied, studying her with concern. You should rest a bit. I'll keep watch. Katherine wanted to protest but couldn't fight the exhaustion any longer. She leaned against a boulder, closed her eyes, and was instantly asleep. When she woke, the sun had moved significantly across the sky. Grant was scanning the back trail with a spyglass. See anything? She asked, rising stiffly. No sign of pursuit yet, but they'll figure out which way we went eventually. He lowered the glass. How's the shoulder? Sore, but manageable. She joined him at the edge of the lookout. I'm sorry for bringing this danger to you. Grant turned to her, his expression softening. Life brings its own dangers with or without help. He tucked the spyglass away. We should move. The descent was faster but no less treacherous, the trail occasionally disappearing altogether, forcing Grant to navigate by memory and instinct. By late afternoon, they could see Silverton in the valley below a bustling mining town with a railroad depot clearly visible. We'll approach after dark, Grant decided. Less chance of being spotted that way. They made camp in a sheltered hollow, eating the last of their food as the sun set. In the gathering twilight, Katherine found herself studying Grant's profile, memorizing the line of his jaw, the way his eyes crinkled when he spoke. What will you do? She asked. After I'm gone, Grant poked at their small fire with a stick. Same as before, I suppose. Hunt, fish, occasionally guide travelers who need help in the mountains. Sounds lonely. He met her gaze, never minded it before. The unspoken before you hung in the air between them. You could come to California, Katherine said softly. Start fresh. Grant was silent for a long moment. Never been much for cities. Too many people, too much noise. Not all of California is cities, she pointed out. My sister's letter mentioned valleys and mountains as beautiful as these. You asking me to come with you, Katherine Campbell, her heart pounded. Maybe I am. Grant set aside his stick and moved closer to her. Known you less than a week, hardly sensible. When has life ever been sensible? Katherine countered. Especially in times like these. His hand came up to cup her cheek, rough calluses against her soft skin. If I kissed you now, would that be sensible? Instead of answering, Katherine leaned forward, pressing her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, a question asked and answered, then deepened into something more urgent, more needful. When they finally parted, both breathing heavily, Grant rested his forehead against hers. Been alone a long time, he murmured. Might not remember how to be anything else. We can learn together, Katherine whispered back, if you want to. His answer was another kiss, and for a while, the danger pursuing them seemed distant and unimportant compared to the wonder of discovery between them. Reality intruded as the last light faded from the sky. They needed to reach Silverton to get Katherine on that train to safety. Reluctantly, they broke camp and continued their descent toward the town. They approached Silverton from the north, avoiding the main road. The town was still active despite the late hour, the saloons and gambling halls casting yellow light onto the muddy streets. Grant led them to a small livery stable on the outskirts. The elderly stableman, a friend of Grant's, agreed to watch their horses without asking questions, especially after Grant pressed extra coins into his palm. Train to Denver leaves at first light, the old man informed them. From there you can connect west. They made their way cautiously to the train station to purchase tickets. Grant insisted on buying two. You're coming? Katherine asked, hope rising in her chest. At least as far as Denver, Grant replied. Make sure you're safely on your way west. The ticket agent, a bored-looking man with spectacles, barely glanced at them as he took Grant's money and handed over the tickets. But as they turned to leave, Katherine noticed a poster on the wall behind the agent, a crude drawing of her face, with wanted printed above and reward below. Grant saw it too and quickly guided her outside. We need somewhere to lay low until morning, he murmured. They'll be watching the hotels. Where then? Grant considered their options. Church at the end of town. Pastor's an old army friend, different side, but he doesn't hold grudges. The small white church was dark, but a light burned in the adjacent parsonage. Grant knocked softly, and after a moment the door opened to reveal a tall, thin man with silver hair. Anderson. The man's surprised expression quickly turned to understanding as he took in Catherine's exhausted state and their furtive manner. "Better come inside." The pastor, Reverend Michael Hayes, asked no questions as he showed them to a small room at the back of the parsonage. "My wife's visiting her sister in Denver," he explained. "You'll be undisturbed here." "Just until the morning train," Grant assured him. "We don't want to bring trouble to your door." Hayes waved this away. "Helping those in need is never trouble, my friend. Rest. I'll wake you before dawn." Alone in the small room with its single narrow bed, Grant and Katherine faced each other in the dim light of a single candle. "You should sleep," Grant said, moving to settle on the floor. Katherine caught his hand. "Stay with me," she said softly. "Please." He hesitated only a moment before joining her on the bed, his arms encircling her as she rested her head on his chest. The steady beat of his heart beneath her ear was the most comforting sound Katherine had ever heard. "Never thought I'd find someone like you," Grant murmured into her hair. "Especially not half dead in the woods," Katherine smiled against his chest. "Maybe some things are meant to be despite all odds." They lay together in the quiet darkness, the future uncertain but somehow less frightening than it had been before. Dawn came too quickly. Reverend Hayes knocked softly, alerting them that it was time to prepare for departure. They rose, gathered their few belongings, and followed him through the still sleeping town to the train station. The platform was mostly empty, with only a few early travelers waiting for the Denver train. Grant scanned the area carefully, tension evident in his posture. "No sign of Blackwell's men," he said quietly. "But stay alert." The train arrived with a screech of brakes and billowing steam. Passengers began to disembark while the conductor called for boarding. Grant and Katherine moved toward the nearest passenger car, keeping their heads down. They were almost to the steps when a shout rang out from the far end of the platform. "There, it's her." Katherine's head whipped around to see Jacob and four unfamiliar men rushing toward them, pushing passengers aside. "Run," Grant ordered, drawing his revolver as he positioned himself between Katherine and the approaching men. "Not without you," Katherine protested, pulling her own gun. The first shots rang out, sending bystanders screaming for cover. Grant returned fire, driving Jacob and his men behind a stack of freight. "Get on the train, Katherine," Grant shouted as bullets splintered the wooden platform around them. "Now." The conductor was frantically waving for the engineer to depart. Katherine knew they had seconds, not minutes. "Together or not at all," she insisted, firing at Jacob as he attempted to flank them. Her shot caught him in the shoulder, spinning him backward. Grant used the opportunity to pull Katherine toward the train, which had begun to move. "Jump," he yelled, helping boost her onto the steps of the departing car. As she turned to help him aboard, she saw Jacob rising, aiming directly at Grant's back. "Behind you," she screamed. Grant whirled, firing simultaneously with Jacob. Both men staggered. Grant stumbled forward as the train gained speed, reaching for Katherine's outstretched hand. Their fingers connected. Katherine pulled with all her strength, dragging Grant onto the steps as bullets continued to fly around them. They collapsed into the vestibule, the door slamming shut behind them as the train rounded a curve, leaving Silverton and the gunfire behind. "You're hit," Katherine gasped, seeing the blood spreading across Grant's side. "Just a graze," he insisted, though his face was pale with pain. "Did I get him, Jacob?" "Yes," Katherine assured him, helping him to a seat in the nearly empty car. "I saw him fall." She examined the wound a bullet had torn through the flesh of his side, missing vital organs but causing significant bleeding. Using her petticoat, she fashioned a bandage, pressing it firmly against the wound. "Seems we've reversed roles," Grant said weakly. "You doctoring me now, and you'll make it, I promise," Katherine replied, echoing his words from their first meeting. "I give you my word." The train gathered speed, carrying them away from Silverton and the danger that had pursued them. As the adrenaline of their escape faded, exhaustion overtook them both. Katherine kept pressure on Grant's wound, her other hand clasped firmly in his. "California," Grant murmured as his eyes drifted closed. "Never thought I'd go there." "We'll build a new life," Katherine whispered, resting her head against his shoulder. "Together." The journey to Denver took all day, the train winding through spectacular mountain passes and broad valleys. Grant's wound, though painful, proved to be less serious than they had feared. By the time they reached Denver, the bleeding had stopped and color had returned to his face. They spent 3 days in Denver, recovering and making arrangements for the journey west. News reached them that Victor Blackwell had been arrested for the murder of his wife, evidence provided anonymously by one of his household staff who had witnessed the crime. "You're free," Grant told Katherine as they sat in their hotel room reading the newspaper account. "He can't hurt you anymore." Katherine looked up at him, this man who had saved her life and then risked his own to protect her. "I've been free since the moment you found me in those woods," she said softly. "You gave me back my life, Grant Anderson." "And you gave me something to live for besides memories," he replied, taking her hand. "Something worth leaving the mountains for." The train to California departed the following morning, carrying them west across plains and deserts toward a new beginning. Katherine rode ahead to her sister, explaining her imminent arrival with a companion who had become far more than that. They were married by a justice of the peace in Salt Lake City during a brief stop, with only the station master and his wife as witnesses. Katherine wore a simple blue dress purchased in Denver, and Grant wore the first new suit he'd owned since before the war. "Never thought I'd be a married man," Grant admitted as they continued their journey westward. "Always figured I'd die alone in those mountains. And I never thought I'd find love after what Blackwell put me through," Katherine replied, leaning against his shoulder as they watched the landscape roll past. "Shows how little we know about what life has in store for us." They reached San Francisco on a foggy morning in late summer. Katherine's sister, Elizabeth, met them at the station, embracing Katherine with tears and welcoming Grant with genuine warmth. Elizabeth and her husband owned a small ranch in the Sonoma Valley, where they raised horses and grew grapes for the emerging wine industry. They offered Grant and Katherine a place to stay until they could establish themselves. "It's beautiful," Katherine said as they rode through the valley 2 days later, taking in the rolling hills and orderly vineyards. "Different from your mountains, but beautiful in its own way." Grant nodded, his eyes scanning the terrain with the instincts of a man who had lived by his wits in wild country. "Good land," he agreed. "A man could build something here." 3 months later, they purchased a modest property of their own 20 acres of land with a view of the valley, a small orchard of apple trees, and a sturdy cabin that reminded Katherine of Grant's mountain home, though considerably less isolated. Grant took to ranching with the same quiet competence he had shown in the mountains. He raised horses, drawing on his cavalry experience, and soon developed a reputation for training the finest mounts in the valley. Katherine discovered a talent for healing that had begun with caring for Grant's wound. She studied with a local doctor and became known for her knowledge of both traditional medicine and herbal remedies learned from Grant's years in the wilderness. Their first child, a daughter they named Mary after Grant's mother, was born the following spring. As Grant held his tiny daughter in his rough hands, the last shadows of his war experiences seemed to lift from his eyes. "Never thought I deserved this kind of happiness," he confessed to Katherine late one night as they sat on the porch of their home, watching a meteor shower streak across the sky. "Not after the things I did in the war." "Everyone deserves a second chance," Katherine replied, her hand finding his in the darkness. "You taught me that when you found me in those woods," Grant smiled, drawing her closer. "Best thing I ever found, half dead or otherwise." 5 years passed, bringing prosperity, another child, a son named James, and a deepening of the bond between them. The nightmares that had once plagued them both grew rare and eventually ceased altogether, replaced by dreams of the future they were building. Occasionally, news from Colorado reached them. Victor Blackwell had died in prison, unrepentant to the end. The mine that had been the source of his wealth and power was now operated as a cooperative, with the miners sharing in the profits. On the anniversary of the day Grant had found Katherine in the woods, they always took a private moment to remember how their journey together had begun. On the 10th such anniversary, they rode to the top of a hill overlooking their flourishing ranch. Ever regret leaving your mountains? Catherine asked as they dismounted to watch the sunset. Grant shook his head, his once sandy hair now streaked with silver at the temples. Not for a single day. He took her hand, his touch still sending the same thrill through her after all these years. Found something better than solitude. And I found something better than escape, Catherine replied. I found home. As the sun sank below the western horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Grant drew Catherine into his arms. Their kiss held the warmth of a decade of shared joys and overcome challenges, and the promise of many more years to come. In the valley below, their children played in the yard of the house they had built together, their laughter carried upward on the evening breeze. Beyond them, the land they had cultivated flourished, a testament to what could grow from the most unlikely beginnings. You kept your promise, Catherine murmured against Grant's chest, that day in the woods when you said I'd make it. Always intended to, Grant replied, his arms tightening around her. Some promises are too important to break. As twilight deepened into night, they rode home together, side by side as they had been since that fateful day when a wounded woman and a solitary cowboy found in each other something neither had been looking for. But both had desperately needed a second chance, and a love worth fighting for.